Hello, and welcome to Science with Mr. Morgan. In today's episode, we will be learning about reproduction. So, what is reproduction? It's the ability to make the next generation, and it is one of the basic characteristics of life. Now, there are two main methods of reproduction. The first of which is asexual reproduction, which is the process of forming a new individual from one parent. The other is sexual reproduction, which is the process of forming a new individual from two parents. To start, we're going to talk about asexual reproduction first. In asexual reproduction, only one parent is required, which means that the offspring is going to share the exact same genetic material as the parent, making them an exact copy, just like a clone. There are various advantages associated with asexual reproduction, but there are also disadvantages associated with it too. So one advantage associated with asexual reproduction is that it's quick, which means that more offspring can be produced in a shorter amount of time. Another advantage is that it doesn't require the meeting of a male and female organism. This allows organisms to reproduce that are not near others of their same species, for example. One disadvantage is that there is no genetic variation. This means that genetic diseases will always be passed on to their offspring. We've looked at advantages and a disadvantage. Now let's look at different types of asexual reproduction. So one type of asexual reproduction is called binary fission. And this is how bacteria reproduce. How does it work? The chromosome, which is free-floating in the cell, remember, replicates and the cell enlarges. From here, it divides into two cells. As new membranes form, it separates the two cells. After the two cells divide, the two new cells each have one identical chromosome. This allows bacteria to rapidly reproduce. Another type of asexual reproduction is called budding. This causes a growth, or a bud, to form, and is typically due to a disruption in cells. This bud develops and grows by absorbing nutrients from the parent organism and remains attached until it has matured. At this point, it pops off and a new organism has formed. Hydra, fungi, and grapevine can all reproduce this way, just to name a few. Another type of asexual reproduction is called fragmentation. During this, a parent organism breaks into fragments or pieces, and each piece develops into a new organism. Hydras can also reproduce this way, as can starfish and planaria, which is a type of flatworm. The last type of asexual reproduction we're going to talk about today is parthenogenesis. This is when an unfertilized egg cell grows into a new organism, which results in the offspring having half of the amount of genetic material of the parent. This is common in honeybees, but it is not limited to them. In the case of honeybees, asexually produced eggs become drones. Instead of being diploid, they are haploid. Now, those are just a few examples of asexual reproduction. But let's move on and talk about sexual reproduction. With sexual reproduction, two parents are involved, and the sperm and egg cells meet, which then causes fertilization to occur. This fertilization produces what is called a zygote, a fertilized egg. Ultimately, it combines genetic material from both parents, creating a genetically unique organism. Asexual reproduction was identical. Sexual reproduction is genetically unique. The zygote divides via mitosis and grows into an embryo, which will later develop into the organism over the gestational period. Various organisms reproduce via sexual reproduction, and animals are among them. Animals often have gonads, which are organs that produce egg or sperm. Male animals have testes, which produce sperm. Female animals have ovaries, which produce eggs. Now, some animals use what is called external fertilization, which is where fertilization occurs outside of the organism itself. This is very common in water with aquatic animals like frogs and fish. If you've ever been walking around a pond and seen a bunch of eggs that later turn into a tadpole, or many tadpoles, then you have seen the effects of external fertilization. With this method of fertilization, the gametes combine by chance. While some use external fertilization, other animals use internal fertilization, where fertilization occurs within the organism. Internal fertilization is common in many land animals. Typically, male animals have a penis that deposits sperm into the vagina of the female organism. Some animals that use internal fertilization do not follow this methodology, though. For example, birds have what is called a cloaca instead of a penis or a vagina. Their cloaca is used for reproductive purposes, but it is also used as a common chamber that serves as an outlet for their urinary and digestive tracts. So bird poop is a mix of a bunch of things, not just poop. When they reproduce, male birds place their cloaca close to a female bird's cloaca to deposit sperm. Now, before we move on to plants and fungi, we're going to take a little time and talk specifically about human anatomy as it relates to reproduction. Starting with male reproductive organs, there is the penis, which is a cylinder-shaped organ that contains the urethra and is used to excrete urine and sperm out of the body. There are the testes, which are two egg-shaped organs that produce sperm and secrete testosterone. These are found within the scrotum. There is the epididymis, which is a tightly coiled tube that is found within the scrotum on top of the testes. This tube is so tightly coiled that if it were to be uncoiled, it would be 20 feet in length. It is where sperm grow and mature and are stored until they leave the body. There is the vas deferens, which is a tube that carries sperm from the epididymis to the urethra. There is the prostate gland, which is located beneath the bladder and secretes fluid that mixes with sperm to help form semen. Semen is a white liquid that carries sperm, sugar, which is used as energy for the sperm cells, and various enzymes and other substances to help the sperm survive. Now, moving on from the reproductive organs themselves to the gamete, the male reproductive sex cell, or gamete, is sperm. Sperm are very, very small cells. In fact, they are the smallest cell within the human body. There are three main parts to sperm cells. The first part is the head. The head contains the nucleus and holds all of the DNA. It also contains enzymes that help the sperm break through the cell membrane of an egg so fertilization can occur. The second part is the midpiece. The midpiece is filled with mitochondria, which produces the energy using the sugar that the sperm uses to move. The third part is the tail, which moves kind of like a propeller. It's called a flagella, and it's used to push the sperm forward at a speed of up to 30 inches per hour, which might seem very slow, but proportionally, it's super fast given how small they are. Now that we've covered male reproductive organs and gametes, let's talk about female reproductive organs. To start, there is the vagina, which is a cylinder-shaped organ found inside the female body. One end of the vagina opens at the outside of the body, and the other connects to the uterus via the cervix. If sperm are released into the vagina, they travel through it into the uterus and continue through to the fallopian tubes. During birth, the baby may pass from the uterus through the vagina to leave the body. Now, if it's a cesarean section, it is cut out. It does not travel through the vagina. There is the uterus, that is a hollow organ with muscular walls and the location of where a baby develops until birth. There are the fallopian tubes, which are narrow tubes that open off from the uterus. There is one tube for each ovary. It is important to note that these are not attached to the ovaries themselves. At the end of the tubes near the ovaries, there are finger-like projections that sweep a released egg into the fallopian tube. Once these eggs are swept up, they travel through the tubes to the uterus. Fertilization occurs within the fallopian tubes themselves. There are also the ovaries, which are two small oval-shaped organs that are located on either side of the uterus that secrete estrogen. Each ovary contains thousands of eggs that are present at birth, but they are not fully developed. After puberty has begun, about one egg a month completes development and it is released by the ovary. Now that we've covered the female reproductive organs, let's move on to the gamete. The female reproductive cell, or gamete, is the egg. Once again, eggs are female gametes that form in the ovaries and are released into the fallopian tubes like we have been covering. As I just mentioned, they are formed before birth, but do not fully develop until the body hits puberty. Remember our conversation about meiosis? Well, meiosis 1 occurs before birth, and meiosis 2 occurs much later at puberty, where the eggs develop in an ovary about once a month. And what do I mean by development? Well, eggs rest in a nest of cells that are known as a follicle. The follicle and the egg grow larger over a couple of weeks. Once that egg is large enough, the egg ruptures out of the follicle and through the wall of the ovary, which is called ovulation. The egg is then swept into the fallopian tube, where it travels to the uterus. If fertilization and implantation do not occur, it exits the body via menstruation. Enough about humans, let's move on to sexual reproduction with plants. Plants have different reproductive organs than animals do. Plants with flowers, which are also called angiosperms, have their reproductive organs in the flower themselves. Sperm is contained in the pollen, and the egg is contained in the ovary deep within the flower itself. So fertilization of a plant, or specifically of an angiosperm, can occur via self-pollination or cross-pollination. Self-pollination is where the egg is fertilized by the pollen of the same flower. Like the name suggests, a plant is pollinating itself. Cross-pollination is where sperm from the pollen of one flower fertilizes the egg of another flower. This allows for a new combination of traits because it's not sharing or coming from the same flower. This occurs when pollen is carried by the wind to another flower, or when animal pollinators like honeybees or butterflies carry pollen from flower to flower. Plants have a special reproductive cycle known as an alternation of generations. This is where plants alternate between having diploid cells and haploid cells from generation to generation. The sporophyte generation is the generation that has diploid cells. For many, many plants, such as angiosperms, this is the major stage of the life cycle that they are in. There is also the gametophyte generation, and this is the generation that has haploid cells. How this alteration of generations works is as follows. The haploid gametophyte produces gametes via mitosis. It's already haploid. Sperm then fertilizes the egg, producing a diploid zygote that develops into the sporophyte. Later on, the diploid sporophyte produces haploid spores by meiosis. The haploid spores then go through mitosis, developing into the haploid gametophyte, and this cycle repeats. Let's finish up our conversation about sexual reproduction today with talking about fungi. Earlier I did mention that they can undergo asexual reproduction, but fungi can also undergo sexual reproduction. And this occurs via positive and negative strains. When the filaments of a positive and a negative fungi meet, a zygote is formed. Each zygote receives DNA from the two parent strains, one from the positive, one from the negative. And with that, it brings us to the end of today's lesson. Until next time,